You know that famous lyric from the classic musical Cabaret? It goes, "Money makes the world go round. A mark, a yen, a buck, or a pound is all that makes the world go round." It's a catchy tune, right? And honestly, if you just sit down and watch the 24-hour financial news networks, or just look at our culture's absolute obsession with the constant hustle, you'd think it was a fundamental law of physics. But in this explainer, we are going to stop and ask a really hard question. Does money actually make the world go round, or does it just keep us endlessly spinning? Welcome to our deep dive into the true biblical meaning of financial freedom.
Let's just expose the modern illusion for a second, okay? We are constantly aggressively sold this idea that true financial freedom means unlimited consumption. It's the dream of buying whatever we want, whenever we want it, no questions asked. But the highly ironic truth, and this is something all the sources we're analyzing today agree on, is that relentlessly pursuing more almost always leaves us feeling more trapped. Instead of becoming free, we actually become slaves to consumerism. We become shackled to our debt. So the big question is, how do we actually break out of that trap?
Okay, here is the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with the illusion of wealth, move into the concept of God owns, we manage, then look at the year of Jubilee. After that, we'll break down the parable of the talents, get super practical with the 10-10-80 plan, and finally wrap up with the idea that true freedom is generosity.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the illusion of wealth. It is time to redefine what true freedom actually looks like. To really understand biblical financial freedom, we first have to totally dismantle the worldly financial myths that are just constantly buzzing around us. There is such a stark contrast between secular freedom and biblical freedom. I mean, think about it. Secular freedom is all about hoarding. It's hoarding enough wealth so you can be completely independent, answering to nobody, usually in some sort of early, isolated retirement. But biblical freedom, it is radically different. It actually rests on four very distinct pillars. First, it's about being absolutely free of debt, because as the proverb says, the borrower is slave to the lender. Second, it's being free from the love of money itself. It's about finding real contentment rather than just chasing the next shiny big purchase. Third, it's being free to give generously to others. And fourth, and this is a big one, it's actually being free to enjoy what you have as a gift, totally without guilt, because your priorities are finally in the right order.
Moving on to Section 2, God owns, we manage. This is the core paradigm shift.
The absolute foundational truth of biblical finance is perfectly captured in Psalm 24:1. It says, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it." Think about the weight of that statement. Every single dollar, every asset you hold, every moment of your time, it all originates from the Creator. When we actually truly grasp this concept, it is a game changer. It completely removes that incredibly heavy, exhausting burden of possessing everything and replaces it with the much more peaceful, focused purpose of managing.
So the absolutely crucial point here is the massive difference between ownership and stewardship. See, when we act like owners, we carry the weight of the entire world on our shoulders. It is incredibly anxiety-inducing, it makes us hoard our resources out of pure fear, and it forces us to be entirely self-reliant. But stewardship is peaceful. If God is the ultimate owner of the portfolio, then a sudden market crash or a massive unexpected bill isn't a threat to our own supreme sovereignty. No, it's a management issue. It's an issue we take directly to the actual owner. It shifts our entire focus away from frantic hoarding and toward true purpose, relying wholly on God's provision.
To put this profound idea into daily practice, the late Dr. Bill Bright coined this brilliant concept called financial breathing. It goes like this. Just as you literally need to physically breathe in and out to stay alive, you need financially to breathe to stay spiritually healthy. You exhale by confessing the sin of claiming personal ownership of your resources, actively letting go of that incredibly tight white-knuckled grip you have on your wallet. And then you inhale by acknowledging God's lordship over your time, your talents, and your treasure, trusting Him entirely to guide how you use them.
Let's look at Section 3, the Year of Jubilee. This is the ancient economic reset.
Now, you might be wondering, if God is the ultimate owner, how exactly did He design economies to function? Well, we can actually trace the chronological math of this back to ancient Israel with the Jubilee. God established this brilliant, built-in cycle of rest that was designed specifically to prevent perpetual debt and systemic poverty. Here's how it worked. Every 7th year was a Sabbath year for the land, a time to let the earth rest. But the math goes a lot deeper than that. They counted 7 cycles of these 7 years, so 49 years in total. And then came that monumental 50th year. That was the Year of Jubilee. It was essentially the ultimate systemic release valve for the entire ancient economy.
And what exactly went down during this 50th year? Well, it was a massive, society-wide reset. We're talking completely unprecedented debt relief. Debts were totally forgiven, zeroed out. Individuals who literally sold themselves into servitude just to pay off crushing debts were freed to go back home. Ancestral land that had been sold off during hard times was legally returned to its original family line. This system effectively prevented generational wealth from indefinitely concentrating in the hands of a powerful few, and it ensured that every single family eventually got a totally clean slate.
The arrival of this incredible year was signaled by what's called the Yovel, the loud sounding of the ram's horn on the Day of Atonement. I want you to just think for a second about the profound psychological and spiritual relief of hearing that horn echo through the streets, knowing your debts were gone. Today, obviously, modern banks aren't out there observing the Year of Jubilee, but the deep spiritual principle absolutely still stands. We live in a culture that is just deeply, heavily burdened by credit card and consumer debt. The biblical precedent here shows us that God deeply desires freedom and a fresh financial start for his people. He does not want us living in lifelong, crushing financial servitude.
All right, Section 4, the parable of the talents. We are looking at the mandate to multiply.
Moving over into the New Testament, we encounter a teaching that directly counters a really common misconception. See, some folks think biblical finance just means living as minimally as possible and essentially burying your money safely in the sand to avoid being greedy. But Jesus tells the parable of the talents to give us a very clear, unapologetic mandate to multiply what we've been given. Before we look at the story itself, we really need to understand the scale here. A talent in its original Greek context, a talenton, was not just some shiny little coin you put in your pocket. It was a massive unit of weight, roughly equivalent to 20 years of a common laborer's wages. 20 years! It represents a truly massive, life-changing amount of capital. So when the master in this parable hands over these talents to his servants, he isn't giving them a tiny allowance. He is entrusting them with literal millions of dollars in today's terms.
So the master leaves on a journey and later returns for a full audit of his estate. What happens? The first servant takes his 5 talents, puts that capital at real, actual risk in the open market, and doubles it. The master is thrilled and commends him. The second servant does the exact same thing with his 2 talents, takes a prudent risk, and receives the exact same commendation. Notice this, the reward wasn't based on the total dollar amount they returned, but on the faithfulness and courage of their action. But then we get to the third servant. He takes his 1 talent and he just buries it safely in the ground to protect it. And for this total paralyzing inaction, he is severely condemned by the master.
So we have to ask, why exactly was that third servant condemned so harshly? Well, the Greek word used by the servant to excuse himself is ephobathen, which literally translates to, I was afraid. The absolute root sin of this parable isn't that he made a bad trade and lost money. It's that his financial decisions were entirely paralyzed by fear, rather than being driven by faithful, courageous stewardship. This brilliantly illustrates a massive challenge for us today. Take a hard look at your own retirement accounts. Look at your giving history, look at your career choices. Ask yourself, are you making decisions out of deep trust in the master, or are you just burying your potential in the sand purely because you are afraid?
Let's transition to Section 5, the 10-10-80 plan. This is where we get into the practical blueprint.
Okay, so now that we've covered the deep theology of ownership and multiplication, how do we actually practically structure our daily money to align with these principles? The sources we're looking at outline a very specific, thoroughly biblical spending blueprint known as the 10-10-80 plan. It is wonderfully simple on paper, but let me tell you, it requires profound discipline in reality. Here is the breakdown. The first 10% goes back to God. The next 10% goes directly into savings. You are effectively paying your future self. And then you live your entire life off the remaining 80%. What this simple ratio does is create absolutely essential margin in a totally chaotic, consumer-driven world. It forces you to live below your means, which, quite frankly, is the absolute bedrock of any real financial peace.
Let's compare this directly to how our culture currently operates. The world's way is to spend our money first, trying to satisfy all our immediate burning desires. Then, maybe we try to save whatever leftovers happen to be sitting in the checking account at the end of the month. And finally, we give to God only if we happen to find some loose change lost in the couch cushions. The biblical way completely 100% reverses this order. It operates on what's called the law of first fruits. We give to God first as a deliberate act of trust. Then we save diligently as a deliberate act of wisdom. And finally, we live contentedly on the rest as a deliberate act of discipline.
Now listen, to actually make the 10-10-80 plan work in your real life, you have to use the dreaded B word. Yeah? A budget. But we really need to reframe this word. A budget is not a financial shackle. It's not a punishment for being bad with money. As this quote perfectly captures, a budget is simply a short-term plan where you actively tell your money where to go before you get to the end of the month and inevitably wonder where it all went. It is the proactive, absolutely necessary tool of a diligent, faithful manager.
This brings us to our final section, Section 6. True freedom is generosity, the ultimate purpose of it all.
Ultimately, we have to realize that the end goal of getting out of debt, sticking to a strict budget, and saving diligently, it isn't just so we can sit on top of a giant, isolated pile of hoarded gold. That's the secular dream, remember? The ultimate, true purpose of biblical financial freedom is radical generosity. I want you to consider the actual spiritual weight of every single transaction you make. As the sources beautifully challenge us to ask, what is God up to in your spending and your saving? Where exactly is the Holy Spirit at work when you swipe your card at the grocery store, or when you leave a tip for a waitress, or when you sit down to allocate your investment portfolio? Every single dollar that passes through your hands is a profound opportunity to actively participate in what God is doing in the world.
Jesus delivered this incredibly hard-hitting truth in Matthew 6:24. He said, "No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money." Money makes a fantastic, incredibly useful tool, but let me tell you, it makes a terrible, utterly ruthless master. At the end of the day, we absolutely have to choose which kingdom we are actively funding. Are we just funding a temporary, fleeting kingdom of our own personal comfort? Or are we truly stewarding God's resources to make an eternal impact?
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Remember, stewardship is simply custody until the audit. So if the master returned today and deeply audited your financial portfolio, your monthly budget, and your calendar, would the numbers actually reflect the faith you profess? Or would it look like you're serving a completely different master entirely? Let that question sit with you as you take a hard look at your own financial stewardship this week.